Welcome to the Blue Economy CRC's webinar series for 2026. I'm Professor Marcus Howard, Emeritus Professor at the University of Tasmania and formerly Head of the Sustainable Offshore Developments Program at the Blue Economy CRC and Project Lead for the project Preconditions for Development of Offshore Wind Energy in Australia. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of the Blue Economy CRC, acknowledge our traditional custodians of the various lands and waters in which we work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I particularly pay my respects to them and to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people in countries in which the CRC partners work. Next slide, please. The Blue Economy CRC has a 10-year life concluding in 2029. We have had 46 past and present industry, government and research partners from 10 countries with deep experience and expertise in aquaculture, marine renewable energy, maritime energy engineering, environmental assessments, and policy and regulation. Currently, there are 41 active participants from across 9 countries supported by a number of strategic partners. The CRC develops targeted industry-focused research and training, aiming to drive innovation, commercially viable, sustainable offshore developments, and new capabilities that will boost renewable energy output, seafood production, and job creation. We're transforming Australia's ocean industries and how they operate and work. Our purpose is to deliver world-class collaborative industry-focused research. We have a vision for a sustainable blue economy underpinned by innovative industries and trusted stewardship of our oceans. The values of the CRC and our activities are about innovation, industry-focused, measured risks, and think beyond conventional approaches to create breakthrough solutions. We're responsive to our partners' needs, open and transparent, honest and reliable in our relationships, commitment and communication with our partners and stakeholders, including obviously the Australian people. We have collaborative focus and the respect partners' diverse needs, working together to generate knowledge relevant to industry and the broader community, and including, focusing on cultural license and engagement. We aim to be world-class focus when we can add genuine value and celebrate our achievements. We're supportive, diverse, respectful engagement, encourage and maintain productive and enjoyable workplace. Today's webinar will present the findings of the project Preconditions for the Development of Offshore Wind Energy in Australia. That was a 3-year project that concluded in towards the end of 2025, with the first half of 2026 in sort of wrap-up stages of the work. It was an interesting and significant project, and the presenters will highlight the results of research undertaken in 4 interconnected work packages. There will be a Q&A session to follow after the presentations, including a presentation from one of our external partners, Dr. Dorothy Dankel from Sintef Oceans in Norway. We will use the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to engage there. The presenters will be looking at the Q&A box during the presentation, and will be answering questions as they can. Now, we'll start, given there's a lot to cover in a relatively short and focused webinar. I'd like to move to the first presentation, Best Practice in Policy and Regulatory Processes, presented by Associate Professor Pedro Fidelman and Dr. Danielle Smith at University of Queensland. Over to you, Pedro and Danielle.
Thanks, Marcus, and I believe you can see my slides. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be focusing on the policy and regulatory preconditions for offshore wind development. So as you may know, Australia's offshore wind sector is at an early stage of development, and policy and regulatory arrangements are evolving alongside early project activities. So this presentation focuses on the policy and regulatory preconditions that shape how offshore wind development unfolds in practice. So the analysis that we present in this presentation draws on international experience to identify common approaches across more established offshore wind contexts. These insights are then used to inform discussion as Australia's framework continues to develop. Our study covers several areas where international experience appears particularly relevant to how offshore wind governance is taking shape in Australia. Because of time constraints, I'll focus on three of those areas. So the first area relates to early spatial planning and site identification. Across the jurisdictions we analyzed, offshore wind development is supported by spatial planning processes that help clarify where development, is more likely to be appropriate and how it may interact with other marine uses. For example, in the Netherlands, marine spatial planning is combined with forward-looking roadmaps and designated development zones, which are supported by detailed spatial and environmental information. So this helps provide early signals about development priorities and reduce uncertainty for proponents and other marine users. In Australia, spatial planning for offshore wind is still developing. We're still in the early stages. Declared areas under the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act provide an initial spatial focus, but do not yet offer the same level of planning integration or spatial details seen in some international jurisdictions. As a result, in Australia, proponents draw on a mix of available data sets during the feasibility stage and considerations of coexistence with other marine uses are addressed progressively through project level processes. So this highlights how spatial planning may play a stronger role over time as Australia's framework develops. So the second area relates to how regulatory processes are sequenced and coordinated over time. Internationally, planning, licensing, and environmental assessment processes are often more clearly sequenced with defined roles and points of interactions across agencies. For example, in the Netherlands and UK, there is a more structured relationship among spatial planning, the allocation of development rights, and project level approvals. So this helps support more predictable development pathways and clearer expectations for proponents. In Australia, early experience suggests that the overall regulatory pathways is broadly workable, but coordination and sequencing are still being established in practice. In that context, proponents engage often in parallel with multiple processes under the OEI Act and the EPBC Act and relevant state systems. So these processes involve different timing, information requirements, and decision points, particularly at the interface between offshore and onshore components. So as the Australia system develops, these relationships are likely to become clearer through guidance and implementation. So this also an area where international experience may help inform ongoing development in Australia. So the third area concerns the availability and use of environmental spatial information. So internationally, there is an emphasis on the early provision of environmental and spatial information, either through government-led baseline studies or clearly defined expectations for proponents. For example, in Germany, environmental assessment processes are closely linked with spatial planning, helping integrate environmental considerations early and supporting more coordinated decision-making. In Australia, the availability of baseline environmental and spatial information varies across regions and continues to develop. So this current shapes how feasibility investigations are undertaken and how potential impacts, including cumulative effects and interactions with other marine uses, are considered at early stages. This context also influences stakeholder engagement, as differences in data availability can affect how risks and uncertainties are perceived. Over time, expectations around data assessment approach and information sharing are likely to become more consistent. And this is another area where international experience provides useful insights. To conclude, the findings suggest that the key issues relate less to the presence of regulatory frameworks and more to how planning, assessment, and engagement processes operate and interact in practice. In particular, sequencing, coordination, and the availability of information play a central role in shaping development pathways. International experience does not provide a single model, but it offers useful reference points for thinking about how this process can evolve over time. And as noted previously, this policy and regulatory preconditions shape how offshore wind development evolves on the ground. So I now pass to Danielle, who will further explore the international experience, focusing more specifically on policy and regulation related to underwater noise management. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Pedro. Can everybody see it? Can you see anything?
I think it's the end of your slideshow,
Oh,
Danielle.
Look at that. Try that again. There we go. Can you see that?
Not yet.
It's on my screen.
No, it hasn't come up yet. Sorry, Danielle.
Okay, sorry. Try.
Yep. You're sharing now, but it's not on presentation view yet.
There. Is it working?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Hi, my name's Danielle Smith. So I'm going to give a brief overview of a side component of the project that Professor Pedro discussed. During the project, there were a number of stakeholder participants workshops that were held, and during which one of the workshops, a number of stakeholders highlighted that there was a need for some guidance relating to the potential impacts of underwater noise on cetaceans that result from during the piling activities during the construction of offshore wind farms. So this is a brief overview of a review that I undertook, which looks at international best practice surrounding the regulatory and policy guidance, and also potential mitigation and management measures to incorporate during the environmental impact assessment process. So with the launch of the new climate initiatives agreed at the 30th session of the 1992 UNFCCC held in Brazil, there's a great push towards moving towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so there's a huge transition from previously reliant upon fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy to meet the global environmental ambition and protect our planet. Offshore wind energy holds massive transformative potential in driving a sustainable blue economy. Nearly 500 gigawatts of offshore wind energy is projected to be required by 2030 and 2,465 gigawatts by 2050 if we are to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario under the Paris Agreement. So in order to do that, we've been developing regulatory and policy frameworks that allow us for the environmental permitting process to be as effective and as efficient as possible, whilst minimizing red tape and costly license and permitting applications and administrative delays, while also maintaining the integrity of thorough scientific evaluation and mitigation of potential environmental risks. And having adequate, transparent stakeholder engagement is obviously crucial. So this review undertook a qualitative literature review, and we undertook a comparative case study analysis of international guidance and best practice, and we focused on 4 case studies: the UK, the USA, the Netherlands, and Australia. Now, the USA, when we started to undertake the study, it was 2024, and so that was under the Biden administration, and rather than change, we continued with that policy guidance and that framework. Just to quickly highlight some of the limitations, this does only focus on cetaceans. We don't cover pinnipeds, which is seals, other species, dugongs, any other marine mammals, just cetaceans. And also we don't look at the cumulative impacts of underwater noise, and we are only looking at the construction activities, which are the piling of the wind turbines themselves. So I looked at a myriad of international treaties and guidance. So underwater noise is treated as a form of pollution, both in terms of noise pollution and energy generated. And there is a lot of information out there and a lot of guidance documents, which I synthesized. And as I mentioned, I focused on 4 case studies. So the synthesis insights, what I found was there were limits to the direct transferability of international regulatory frameworks. For example, the Netherlands case study was not readily comparable to Australia, and it also only looked at limited amount of species. They, in their waters, typically have harbour porpoise and harbour seals. That's not really comparable to when we're considering Australia, which has a wide array of marine mammal species and also a variety of environmental conditions. However, the Netherlands was a good case study in terms of looking at the marine spatial planning aspect. They've been planning offshore wind energy spaces for decades, and also they undertake cumulative environmental impact assessments. So that's useful. within the report. Secondly, there was convergence around best practices approaches for managing and mitigating underwater noise from piling activities. There's a number of guidance produced by the UK. The JNCC have issued protocols previously for seismic survey activities and piling activities. Seismic and piling have been treated as comparable in terms of them both being impulsive sound generated. And so the temporary threshold shifts, the TTS, have been used as a guide to piling as well as seismic, and that is at 160 decibels for 95% of seismic shots within a 1 kilometer radius. So this has been a very useful guidance that I've been using. There's also on a state level within Australia, they have produced in South Australia the DTI guidelines for piling of port developments and dredging activities. Now that has been quite useful. However, you've got to take in mind that the depth is much shallower than what would be in the huge wind turbines, which can be in waters up to 30 to even 50 meters depth. Australia has produced the EPBC Act Policy Statement 2.1, again for seismic surveys. There's nothing actually for offshore wind farms right now, which is, I'll discuss shortly why I developed some guidance around that. Lastly, the central role of national regulatory discretion in determining how threshold criteria and mitigation measures are applied in practice. So the application of threshold criteria and marine mammals is shaped by national legislation, and it's completely on a regulatory discretion. In the USA, they have the National Marine Fisheries Service has produced an updated technical guidance on the TTS, which is the temporary threshold shift criteria, and also auditory injury onset criteria. I'll get this table up. This is much easier to have a look at. So they've produced this for impulsive piling, which is impact piling, and non-impulsive, which is vibratory piling. Now, the auditory injury onset criteria replaces the previous permanent threshold criteria, which is the PTS. And the reason for that is that there's been further studies that indicate that auditory injury onset criteria can occur even when it doesn't result in PTS thresholds. So this is a much lower criteria. So the main outputs of this review are regulatory and policy options. So it's a step-by-step guide for proponents, taking you through the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act process in combination with the EPBC Act process. And the last element is I've put together mitigation and management options for underwater noise from piling during offshore wind construction in Australia. And so these are draft protocols. They've obviously not been confirmed by industry and government regulatories at this point. They're merely just guidelines. And I take you through from the pre-startup visual observation procedures all the way down to potential use of acoustic deterrent devices and additional management measures. This is on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, this has a developer would need to go through the EPBC referral process, which is discussed in depth in the report, and probably undertake a site-specific underwater acoustic survey in respect of their development. This report will be published in about 2 weeks, I hope, on the Blue Economy CRC website. And if you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. And I think Leslie will also provide a list if you want to be contacted when the report's available. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Danielle. If you could just stop sharing so we can get to the next screen, and I'll move on to our next speakers, Dr. Hugh Breakey and Larelle Bossi at Griffith University. The presentations are identification of key elements of social acceptability for offshore wind development and the notion of developing integrated integrity systems approaches to offshore wind projects. And so over to you, Hugh and Larelle.
Perfect. Thank you, Marcus. G'day, everyone. So this was work done on the ethics, social acceptance, social license and acceptability facets of the offshore wind development in Australia. It was led by the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law up here at Griffith University in Brisbane. Research team led by Professor Charles Samford and included myself and Larelle and also Beck Marshall-Say. Now, we went through and looked at a range of topics in terms of ethics and social license that we created at the beginning, and then some that arose as the research went on. And there's a variety of them, and we're not going to get through all of them today, but for people who are interested, they're all freely available on the website for this project. I think Leslie shared that already. So you can go there and you can download if you want any more details on any of the things that we're talking about or the things that we move over here. So a few of the topics we covered, we looked at general issues of ethics, values and social license for offshore wind development. We looked at best practice community engagement and also at misinformation. Larelle's going to look at those two topics today. We also did some work on the ethics of NIMBYs, and we did some work on community benefit sharing. That's what I'll be speaking on today. And all of those are available up on the website if you want further information. I'll hand over to Larelle now. She's going to take you through those first topics I mentioned, and then we'll come back to me to chat about community benefit sharing in a bit. Over to you, Larelle.
Thanks, Hugh. Hi, everybody. Just bear with me while I attempt at sharing. I'm assuming that this is not correct. Hold on a minute. Here we go. That's not the first one either. Oh, goodness. Here we go. Apologies. As a philosopher, technology is not always my forte, I have to say. My children tend to teach me most of the things these days. Anyway, here we are. Winds of change, waves of doubt. Trying to work out where I'm putting my banner so I can actually look at my own screen here. How we engage and why it matters. So the energy transition has been framed in policy as inclusive, participatory, and just. But in practice, what we find is engagement is unequal, trust is fragile, and communities feel decisions are already made. So are we genuinely engaging communities, or are we just managing acceptance? That's part of the questions I think I'd like you to have while I'm presenting our findings. So best practice engagement begins with recognizing that community is not a single group. Different stakeholders experience offshore wind in very different ways, whether through place, livelihood, cultural connection, or broader environmental concerns. Who is included in engagement processes directly shapes legitimacy, and if key groups are excluded or engaged too late, this often leads to contestation, delays, and a breakdown in trust. So the starting point is not just engagement, but careful consideration of who is engaged and why their perspective matters. Who is responsible for engagement? A common challenge in offshore wind is that responsibility for engagement is unclear or fragmented. While proponents often lead engagement, government and regulators play a critical role in setting expectations, ensuring fairness and maintaining public confidence. When engagement is treated as something that can be outsourced or reduced to a compliance requirement, its effectiveness is significantly weakened. Best practice requires recognising that engagement is a shared responsibility across the system and a core part of project governance, not an add-on or a compliance task. Principles of best practice, and these are all found in some of the reports and guidance notes that we've put together. So the first one is early and ongoing participation, transparency and accountability, multiple knowledges and stakeholder diversity, cultural well-being and identity, alignment with benefit sharing, adaptive governance and feedback loops. This is actually a really important one because it means that we're actually holding true to the kind of dynamism that is required during these kinds of ethical engagements. I've also cheekishly added a seventh to our usual 6. only because it's a point that we do make. It's just not usually as part of the principles. But it's important to acknowledge that engagement is inherently challenging. Even well-designed processes are unlikely to achieve perfect outcomes, and criticisms should be understood in this context. So these challenges reinforce the need for engagement systems that are flexible, iterative, and capable of learning, so that lessons can be incorporated and practice can improve over time. Misinformation has become incredibly challenging within engagement practices, and so something that, as Hugh mentioned, came up as we were doing our research, and something that I want to spend a little bit of time looking at. So when we talk about misinformation, it's important to firstly distinguish between what type we're talking about. Misinformation refers to inaccurate or misleading information that may be shared without intent to harm. Disinformation, however, is deliberately false or strategic. And then, of course, we have astroturfing, which involves coordinated campaigns designed to appear as grassroots community sentiment. In practice, these categories often overlap and reinforce each other, particularly within local networks and community spaces. Importantly, though, the scope of misinformation is not uniform. It varies by place, by issue, and by levels of trust. So rather than treating misinformation as a single external problem, it needs to be understood in context as something that interacts with existing concerns and uncertainties. Why misinformation matters? Misinformation matters because it can erode trust, amplify uncertainty, and shape how projects are understood and judged. But it's also important to acknowledge that offshore wind is not a space of complete certainty. There are knowledge gaps that should be acknowledged. Scientific knowledge is evolving, impacts are complex, and in some areas, evidence remains contested and incomplete, even between experts. This matters because it limits what science can alone do. Providing more data or correcting inaccuracies does not necessarily resolve concerns, particularly when those concerns are grounded in values, uncertainty, or trust in institutions. So the issue is not simply a lack of information, it is how information is interpreted within broader social and political contexts. Getting responses right. Responding effectively to misinformation requires moving beyond simple correction. Dismissing concerns as misinformed can undermine trust and reinforce division. Similarly, relying solely on facts or technical evidence is often insufficient, particularly where concerns are value-based or rooted in uncertainty. Instead, responses should focus on underlying concerns, including trust, fairness, and perceived impacts. So effective responses are relational, not just corrective. In collaboration with colleagues at the University of Wollongong, we actually undertook a social listening analysis examining both public submissions and social media discussions. Now, this was pretty exciting for some philosophers who don't usually get outside or away from our computers. We actually got out and spoke to community members and colleagues from across the borders. This work identified 8 distinct community personas, each characterized by different values, priorities, ways of reasoning, and sources of evidence. Importantly, this showed that communities are not simply for or against offshore wind. Instead, engagement needs to accommodate a diversity of perspectives, with the aim of finding that we might call an overlapping consensus, where people may support the same outcome, but for 2 very different reasons, or multiple reasons. The second key insight is the importance of place. Across different groups, strong place-based identities emerged, particularly connections to coastal environments through recreation, livelihood, and cultural meaning. In fact, the majority of the 8 characters attach themselves to place. The research highlights the need to move beyond dismissing concerns as NIMBYism. Many responses reflect legitimate ethical issues, including place attachment, environmental concern, governance, and fairness. And finally, engagement itself can play a constructive role. In workshops, asking participants to even step into different personas helped build empathy, reduce defensiveness, and revealed both tensions and common ground between them. Together, these findings reinforce that community responses are not simply informational, they are interpretive, relational, and grounded in values. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time here looking at the symbolic dimensions of offshore wind, because they tend to come up in a lot of the things that we have been talking about. One of the key insights from our work is that offshore wind is not understood purely in technical or scientific terms. It is interpreted symbolically through what it represents to different communities. For some, offshore wind signals progress, climate action, and opportunity. For others, it can represent disruption, loss of place, or decisions being imposed from the outside. These interpretations are shaped by place attachment, identity, perceptions of fairness, and levels of trust in institutions and processes. This is important because what is often labeled as misinformation can in fact be an attempt to express these deeper concerns. So if engagement focuses only on correcting facts, it risks missing the underlying meanings that are actually driving community responses. Here are some key takeaways reflecting a shift in how we think about engagement in offshore wind. It begins with relationships, not agendas. Recognizing that community knowledge, values, and priorities should help define what success looks like. It requires moving beyond consultation and toward co-design, where communities are actively involved in shaping outcomes from the outset. Transparency is critical, particularly around power, purpose, and the limits of influence. Without this, trust is difficult to sustain. Engagement must also start early and continue over time. It is not a one-off activity, but an ongoing relationship that you're building with communities. This includes respecting cultural and contextual differences, acknowledging that communities have their own governance systems, values, and ways of knowing. And ultimately, engagement must move beyond communication to connection, fostering trust, empathy, and mutual understanding. Because in the end, engagement is not simply part of the process. It is what gives the process legitimacy. So the question is not how we overcome resistance. It is whether communities can recognize themselves in the future we are actually building. Here is a list of references there just as a snapshot. I suspect no one's going to sit there and take those down. Thank you. Over to you, Hugh.
Terrific. Thank you kindly, Larelle. All right, I will share my screen. And I will be talking about one particular issue that came up in our research, and it was an issue that we hadn't anticipated too strongly at the beginning as being significant, but it was arising in international context, especially some places relevantly like Australia in the way that they engage with offshore wind. And so it was one that we then took an interest in and started to look at, and it is what we do with community benefit sharing schemes for new energy developments, and a particular concern that has been raised with them almost since their very beginning, which is that in some cases they can function as bribes. I'm going to admit that initially this was not something that I thought was going to be a significant issue. And you can understand the frustration that government and developers might have when they're criticised for putting in a wind development, and then there is a concern that the wind development is not giving local benefits, and that all the good things from it, all the mitigation of global warming, and all of the energy that's being created, they're of course national or international goods. They don't actually benefit the local communities, and the local communities might well feel that they are on the receiving end. They're being asked to shoulder burdens, and they are not getting the benefits. And so one thing that you might do in a case like that is look at, well, what type of direct benefits can we actually do to the local local community in order to try and make this system fairer? And so this is one of the things that community sharing schemes were created in order to improve. But then they were faced with this objection that now it looks like you're bribing the local people to accept what's going on. Which could make the governments and local developers feel like they were getting caught a little between the devil and the deep blue sea, and they would be criticised whichever way they went. And well, I think that is a concern, and we do have to be very wary of situations where we do back people into a corner where they're going to be able to be morally criticised for whatever they do. There is something to bribery concern, and it is worth making sure if benefit sharing schemes are rolled out in Australia, that they're done in ways that mitigate that concern. So I'll run through it now. This is based on a paper that we published last year in Energy Research and Social Science. And I'll go through what are benefit sharing schemes. I'll raise the justifications that can be put for them. And I'll talk about, well, how can bribery be a concern here? And I'll talk about some policy implications. So community benefit schemes involve giving back to the community. They can be funds that are benefiting local residents. They can be benefits in kind. They might be building a park or a footy field, or fixing up roads, other projects of that sort. They can be local ownership. That's probably not likely to happen in Australia, but has been really important in some European countries. And they can have local contracting and employment, for example, which could be one reason why local communities might be enthusiastic about having new energy developments near them. They can be legally required in some cases, but they're often not. So there's a range that can happen here. In some cases, they're legally mandated and they'll be overseen by regulatory bodies. In other cases, there might be quasi-legal requirements. There might be mandatory reporting, for example, or there may be some weight given to them in license granting processes. Or they might be recommended by, perhaps guided by government, but only informally. Or they might be entirely voluntary, and they might be something that the developer themselves is taking on in order to give back to the local community. So why might these be good ideas to do? The range of justifications have been put forward for them by developers, by industry bodies, and also by government. I've listed 6 there. First is fair distribution, making sure communities get their fair share. Second is appropriate compensation, making up for negative impacts, perhaps visual impacts, for example, if it's a coastal area and they are close enough to shore that they're going to be visible. Perhaps there's local tourism that could create negative impacts. Sometimes there'll be baseline demands. So these might be just minimum expectations for local business. An expectation, for example, that if you're doing things out of our community, then you should be contracting with us. You should be obeying all the relevant regulations. You should be paying your appropriate amount of tax, all of those sort of very just basic conditions under which we allow businesses to operate in our midst. It might be justified on the basis of legitimate process, saying, well, this was a negotiated result of our community engagement. Could be seen as corporate social responsibility. It's just the right thing to do. Or, of course, there could be legal obligations. If someone's required by law to deliver their scheme, then you might want to criticise the law, but you can't criticise anybody who's simply following the law. Now, the 3 main ones here, baseline demands number 3 there is an important one, but it's not normally a focus of benefit sharing. Benefit sharing becomes very significant and very obvious when it's actually building stuff or handing over cash or giving out grants. And if you go to justify them, it really looks like those first 2, fair distribution or appropriate compensation, are going to be the things that you're going to have to be looking at. They look like the most substantial and weighty reasons for why this might be being done and why it should be accepted it's being done. Could they be a bribe? Well, it depends what we mean by bribe. They're clearly not a legal bribe, right? They're not a bribe in the ordinary sense of someone paying off a public official. So any of the opprobrium, any of the moral concern we have for that type of action isn't appropriate in this case. But if we define a bribe a little bit more loosely as the promise or delivery of a benefit that influences a party to act in a way desired by the briber, in cases where that party morally should not be influenced to act in that way by that benefit, usually because they possess a special obligation not to act in that way. For example, they're a public official. Now, community benefits may well influence a community to be more supportive or less resistant to a development. In fact, sometimes that's the very reason they're instigated. The question becomes, is that influence appropriate? So in democracies, local views and local votes can impact on operations, especially renewable energy developments on nearby oceans, if you're a coastal community, for example. In cases where citizens have cultural, ecological, or governance concerns with a development, well, they should be taking their custodian and stewardship roles, that is, their concern to be looking after their local environment, and their civic responsibilities, that is, their capabilities as a voter who is taking seriously the questions about what should be done in their local area, So they have responsibilities they should be taking seriously. This doesn't mean that they shouldn't be influenced by economic benefits or employment benefits of the region. They're clearly legitimate things that decision makers should take into account. However, if the benefit sharing schemes or their timing, nature, benefits, or presentation work to overwhelm, preempt, sideline, or supersede those other concerns or processes, then this could exert an inappropriate influence on locals' behaviour. And that, by the definition I just gave, would count as a bribe. It's important to note it wouldn't merely appear as a bribe. It is morally correct to be saying if that's what's happening, then what's going on is there is a type of bribery going on. This is not merely a perception issue, it's a genuine issue that we want to take seriously. If we do take it seriously, what does that look like? Okay, so policy implications would be focus on those baseline demands and in-kind benefits, don't just hand out cash, avoid exceptionally large community benefits, ensure the development is well justified on all other grounds. Handing out stuff is not okay if the environmental stuff or the energy development stuff just isn't worked through sufficiently. Ensure the scheme sits appropriately within larger governance and community engagement processes that Larelle was speaking about. Prioritise compensations for losses, harms come first. Make the scheme's purpose fully transparent. Don't pretend it's doing something it's not. Aim for a legal mandate or at least state endorsement of the scheme. It's good to have some oversight, and make sure you maintain the general trustworthiness of the developers, industry, and the governance system surrounding it. All of those things done, and these things can be worthwhile, they can serve important moral purposes, but they are going to influence civic decision making, so you have to make sure you get them right. All right, that's just about us for time. If you want to know more, you can contact Larelle or I at our emails or reach out to us. I will stop sharing, and thank you all for your attention, and I'll hand back to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks, Larelle, for a really interesting part of the project, and I encourage participants to contact you on it. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Hongjun Fan from the Australian Maritime College, who we're focusing on Australia's wind supply chain from gaps to coordination challenges. So over to you, Hongjun. You can start sharing your slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I'd like to share some key findings from our study on Australian offshore wind supply chain based on work package 3 of this project. This research work was led by Associate Professor Peggy Chen and Professor Stephen Calhoun from the Australian Maritime College, University of Tasmania. So I'd like to start with a simple idea. Australia has a strong offshore wind opportunity, but delivering it successfully depends heavily on how well the supply chain evolves. So today, I'd like to focus on what the evidence tells us and what it means for the industry and the policymakers. So first, let's look at this Swiss cheese model. It shows the ranked barriers to offshore wind development in Australia based on our online survey results. As we can see, number 1, social acceptance, and number 3, environmental impact have already been well covered by my colleagues in previous presentations. What's interesting here is that many of the key barriers are supply chain related, including port, vessels, component supply, and workforce availability. So supply chain really matters. This table shows project timelines in Gippsland area, which is the most advanced offshore wind zone in Australia. And there's one key message from this table. The first wave of projects will happen simultaneously, not sequentially. So this means that projects are not independent. They compete for the same resources and they create overlapping demand. So the challenge is how to manage the supply chain system. To understand the supply chain system, we combined 3 research approaches: desk study, interviews and questionnaire survey, and scenario-based modeling. And we conducted 14 interviews with developers, ports, suppliers, and the government. And we also got 33 survey responses from key sectors. We developed a demand scenario modeling model for Gippsland because Gippsland projects are more certain than other areas projects at the moment. And we assumed fixed bottom offshore wind turbine with capacity from 18 to 22 megawatt per unit, according to actual conditions in Bossi Strait. The purpose of the modeling is to understand how demand may evolve under different scenarios. We modeled basic, medium, and high scenarios. The basic scenario is Victoria government's target, and the high scenario, we assumed all licensed projects will be delivered by 2040, and the medium scenario is 60% of high scenario. So here you can see some selective results from our modeling. For example, under basic scenario, the wind turbine numbers will reach to around 400 by 2040. And for aerial cable, by 2040, the total length will be around 1,000 kilometers. And vessels, for example, for service and operation vessels, at least 3 vessels will be required by 2040. And jobs for operation and maintenance jobs, by 2040, the demand will be around 3,000. So the demand is very big. From our analysis, we identified 4 major gaps. They are ports, vessels, manufacturing, and workforce. And they are not separate issues. They interact with each other, and together they shape the overall supply chain system performance. So let's start with ports. Ports are not only seen as infrastructure. We always talk about the channels, land, berth, and lifting capacity, but also in offshore wind projects, ports play a much more strategic role. They determine staging, assembly, and project sequencing. So ports are like anchors for offshore wind projects. Because we are dealing with very limited offshore wind supporting ports in Australia, for example, in Bossi Strait, we have only 3 large ports, but many projects progressing in parallel. So how to use these ports? One port, one project, or sharing them, the decision will directly affect overall efficiency. And we gave some case studies in our research report. The report will be published in the next few months. And we had a lot of quantitative case studies in the report. If you are interested in the supply chain, you can have a read. And for vessels, projects will rely heavily on internationally chartered vessels. And global competition is already strong. So vessel access becomes a strategic issue, not just a procurement. Vessels need to be secured years before. And this shifts the mindset from short-term contracting to long-term planning. And for manufacturing, early projects will rely on importing, but there is a strong potential for localization as well. However, industry feedback in our report is very clear. Suppliers need policy certainty and offtake visibility before investing. So localization is not just a capability or capacity issue, it's a confidence issue. And for workforce, the issue is not only quantity, it is also skill type and timing. We see shortages in engineering, construction, technicians, in particular GWO certificated capacity. And a very important point here is that if training starts after a final investment decision, it's too late. So workforce development needs to be forward-looking. And based on our findings, we developed 3 roadmaps for Bossi Strait and to support the delivery of offshore wind with the robust and resilient supply chain. I'll briefly walk you through these 3 roadmaps. In the basic scenario, as you can see on this map, most key components like nacelles, blades, cables are imported from overseas, like from Asia and Europe, and limited components like towers and foundations can be sourced from local factories, for example, from WA or Tasmania or Victoria. And vessels are largely chartered internationally. But small vessels like crew transfer vessels can be built in Australian shipyards. So on this map, domestic role is mainly logistics and support, like marine services and training. So this reflects a high reliance on global supply chain. And in the medium scenario, some localization begins. More components like towers, cables, and steel structures can be sourced locally. And domestic shipbuilding will build medium-sized vessels like SOVs and can support ship maintenance and ship repairs. So this represents progressive localization. In the high scenario, we see cluster development around key ports like Geelong, Hastings, and Bell Bay. Manufacturing can be developed. Service hubs on both sides can be formed. So we see stronger domestic capability and capacity. So this is a more mature system. And implications from our study. For industry, first think beyond the project. There are overlap and congestion risks. So portfolio thinking matters more than project thinking. And second, secure critical access early. For example, vessels, port windows, and the key contractors should be treated as strategic assets, not late-stage procurement items. And invest selectively. Not every part of the supply chain should be localized immediately. The stronger path is to invest where Australia has scalable potential, like towers, foundations, marine services, training, and secondary structure elements. And this reflects a shift from isolated decisions to system-aware decisions. And for policymakers, first, enable system-level coordination. Second, reduce investment uncertainty. Clear policy signals and long-term planning are critical to unlock like private investment. And plan early for port, vessels, and workforce. This is essential to avoid bottlenecks. And 3 takeaways from our work package. Australia has a strong offshore wind opportunity, and supply chain capability and capacity can grow with the pipeline of projects, and early coordination enables long-term success. So this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hong Jun. That's very interesting work, and thank you and your colleagues Peggy and Stephen for their work. I'll now call on Martin Farley to load up a presentation. Martin and I will be presenting the work from work package 4, which was a synthesis of integration synthesis of the work we've been done by the 3 other packages. So over to you, Martin.
Yes, thanks very much, Marcus. Hello, everybody. I think a great lead-in, I think, for what we're talking about in terms of taking a systems perspective on offshore wind and the way it develops within Australia, and the work that Marcus and I have done around that. I think the issue is here that there's been a huge range of factors identified today, not only in terms of the way the three work packages of the policy, regulatory, community acceptability and supply chain fit together, but also interdependency of all of the elements that make each one of those work or come together. So from our perspective, I think there's an issue here around the idea of the research packages themselves have identified both strong interdependencies, but also lead lag social and technical interrelationships. As has been identified today, offshore wind energy has a huge technical component to it, but it also has a major social implication in terms of either acceptability or non-acceptability. So the way that we've approached it is thinking about what's the systemic impact of these findings for the future of offshore wind in Australia. So the research elements themselves are, as identified in the title of the program, key foundational elements of what's actually a complex dynamic system, which is critical to the development of scalable offshore wind. So what we've done is we've applied this sort of idea of thinking about the industry as a jigsaw of a whole range of elements that fit together in a systemic way. And that's the way we've approached putting together those findings in terms of the individual projects. Now, this is the framework that we use for Jigsaw. And in a sense, I'll start with the bottom line. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to build a system representation of how we move from this challenge of Australia pursuing low carbon energy generation in combination with increased onshore value add, digitisation and improved livelihoods. Now, in a sense, that statement is a value statement in relation to looking at the future of Australia one way or another. So what we're only trying to do is create a representation of how we move from this challenge to this impact in the longer term. We want to get to a stage where offshore wind energy provides near-term scalable contribution to our sustainable energy portfolio and flow-on value across communities. We're not doing and trying to produce offshore wind energy because it's a great idea, which it is, but what we're trying to do is to actually produce it in a way that delivers on these strategic objectives. It looks after our natural environment. It actually enhances our market product and service mix across the economy, but it also is about enhancing the capacity of our communities within their own place to become more productive, all of which in a way lead to this idea of community wellbeing and livability. So if we think about this in terms of a logic, what we've done is we've actually identified a strategic intent based on a challenge that we've got. The real challenge we've now got is how do we build a value chain and resource that value chain from our available mix of community capitals to deliver on those objectives in the long term. So what we've done here is we've actually mapped, our programs, the research programs across this idea of the dynamic system. So in the ready colour, we've got the work package 1, which is policy and regulatory. In I think it's a salmony sort of a colour, or it is on my computer, it's a work package 2 in terms of social acceptability. And we've looked at Hongzhou's supply chain work in the green. And the point about it is each of these packages identify a slightly different lead lag type of relationship. And the point about all this, I guess, is that in some ways, the idea of policy is actually designed, if we want policy to work, to actually enable the rest of this stuff to happen. Okay, so it's really critical that if we don't get the policy right, how do we make the rest of it work? So the idea behind system thinking is that if we think about this a little bit like, and it's a form of neural network, if this particular element here around policy and practice and sense making doesn't work, these other elements don't work either. So it's this idea of stock and flow that Hong Jun talked about is also relevant to the idea of policy. If the policy doesn't have the characteristics that enables things to happen, the whole system falls over. So what we identified, and I guess was identified through the issues today, that it's all very well to develop a policy that talks about locational analysis, but the effect of that policy can also be dramatically affected by the idea of social acceptability. And so the point is that we identified earlier in the discussion today, because of uncertainty around the environmental impact and the way that this activity is going to actually occur, is the community going to accept that the policy framework that's been put together actually works? And the point about it is, if we have barriers in this relationship of the way policy and social acceptability work, that creates a big lag in terms of when Hong Shun's supply chain work can work. Now, when we think about the investment for that supply chain work, and I guess the other approval work that goes on before it, that investment is highly impacted by the time. You know, there's a strong time cost commitment to the way that investment is made. And so ensuring that these steps in place achieve both community acceptability, but also work in a way that the market will finance this value chain is actually fundamentally important. So what we're really doing here is doing two things. We're actually working from the top down, saying how can we actually achieve these objectives by designing a value chain, and then all of the tools that we're going to put in place to make that value chain work are fundamental to how efficient and how ethically we approach this. Because as the point that Larelle and Hugh were making, it's really, whilst we can think about this as a technical issue, and whilst there is across Australia probably an acceptability that we want these objectives to occur, that when we start to filter and license it through this idea of place experience and local communities, these factors are nowhere near as settled as we think they might be. So this idea of how we actually translate policy from a national level down into how it impacts on these communities is really important. So going back to the idea of how it works in place, one of the things that we did within, again, Wollongong, was to actually map the value chain of offshore wind against the value chain that relates to how the place operates. So that created a matrix where we're able to see the tensions and opportunities, and where in fact the issues that we need to develop actually start to intersect that community. Really critical stuff in terms of taking a structured way of thinking about those sorts of issues. So the way that we've applied the jigsaw methodology is that this is the first part. So this is the logic model that we showed to you a moment ago. And because it's a system, you can pull the system apart. So what we did was we pulled the value chain out of offshore wind. We pulled the value chain out of a place-based model and looked at the intersection of those things. Now that's, again, provides that really strong picture of where the tensions or where the opportunities occur within a place. Now, early on, we've talked about delivery pathways. I think Pedro raised the idea of delivery pathways early up. Now, the way that we actually create those delivery pathways, which we're using to try and consolidate all of the key issues within the other research packages, is of course another matrix. So what we do is we connect the value chain elements as a vertical axis, our resources and capabilities as a horizontal axis, and that allows us to identify what's the current state of this process, what's the preferred state, and then how do we apply the different resources that we have to enable us to move from here to there. And that's a really fundamental part of what was talked about by, I think, Hugh, but also Hong Shun, in the terms of the way we take this whole industry sector forward and how we orchestrate how all the different elements fit together one way and another. And coming back to Larelle's point, it's really then about how do you create, I guess in a way, a digital twin which supports a combination of action research and action learning, so we can iterate our way to creating this industry that we're really looking to progress. So in terms of the work that we've done, is that what does this mean and how do we apply it? You can have one look at that, the system representation of offshore wind, and you can say, well, yeah, that's an interesting thing to look at. But the point about it is it's actually a picture of what can be achieved. And it's a really exciting and strategic and important picture. But what it also does, it identifies the opportunity cost of not achieving it, but it also identifies, importantly, the critical contribution of the things that we've talked about in the preceding parts of this session. Because if we think about it again, as I talked about, the model that we've got is a form of neural network. And so it only takes one node in a jigsaw to fail or not perform for the rest of the system to falter. So what we're really on about in terms of the integration of these work packages and all the elements within them is trying to surface them to get an idea of the importance of getting it right and what's the cost of failure. So the value chain, whilst it's the visible part that does the heavy lifting, it requires the support of societal capitals, the training, the networks, those things that Hong Jun talked about. And it requires them to ensure that the whole system is equitably and viably implemented. It provides the community with the opportunity to be involved in its development operation, but it also requires it to be to enable the flow and benefits of access to renewable energy at scale. So that's been the focus of our work, and I'll hand over to Marcus to continue on.
Thanks, Martin. Yes, I want to wrap up the synthesis work by going back to the point that I made at the start of this webinar, that each of the substantive work packages that you've heard from this afternoon have provided detailed reports that are in train and will be available publicly through the Blue Economy CRC website. This work, our project work, highlights key linkages through what Martin has pointed out, a value chain, linking policy objectives and regulatory settings to community acceptability, and then the supply chain and further systemic considerations and investment. Next slide, please, Martin. Next slide, thank you. So in mapping our regulatory and approval pathways, including the early OEI experience, there's a number of things. Cross-cutting governance challenges have been identified, as has been explained by Pedro and Danielle. Coordination is critical, and the word of coordination, and it's being developed, and it's as with the policy settings and policy arena evolves, we'll see this to be incredibly important, and also including the state-based planning processes and activities. Social acceptability, clearly important, and the work that the project has done in basing and grounding an integrity framework, I think, has been particularly valuable and useful. So, in a way, the industry and community needs guidance informed by international lessons to build a sector and an industry, and also a community, and this should be based on ethical best practice. Next slide, please, Martin. So this project has highlighted opportunities and challenges in establishing offshore wind supply chain in Australia, but also the sector there. The supply chain profile demonstrates that these connections that we've in our synthesis work have highlighted. I would just like to finish up by saying thank my colleagues for the work that they've undertaken, and look forward to the next stages of work. Thank you, and I'll ask Dorothy Dankel, one of our participants from Sintef Oceans in Norway, to provide a slightly different lens on this in terms of reflecting on challenges and identification from Norway. Over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And what a pleasure to be able to present on this panel. And just a quick comment, all the presentations today are fabulous. I think you guys in Australia are really, really on the right path. And the reason I say this is you'll see a lot of repeats from our experience of our learnings in Norway. So without further ado, just a quick recap of where we are in Europe at the moment, pointing at Norway's goal to have 30 gigawatts by 2040. This is a really difficult goal to have right now, but just to point out, there's 93 million euros right now for a call that we're answering in a European partnership where industry and research is going to work a lot closer together in order to increase European competitiveness for offshore wind. So there's a lot of activity going on now in Europe. In Norway, we just opened in 2023 our very first wind park, and that has been a very important experience on many levels, also the social level, basically because it was built on top of a fishing grounds. And there's a lot of reason why that was done, but there was insufficient stakeholder engagement with the fishing community. And I'll kind of preview about how we mitigated this. The Norwegian government has a very clear position about coexistence. Developers have to have plans for how to work with fisheries and marine traffic and have to involve stakeholders. So this is really part and parcel of what we've already heard today, and coexistence isn't optional. It's actually a scored criterion for these applications. Just to mention, the current process right now is for Utsira Nord. This is a large 3 gigawatt, 3 different spaces project. This will be the world's largest floating wind park that's currently in process, not in the build process, but in the licensing process. So this is just a quick look at the different pre-qualification criteria for Utsira North, sustainability and positive local benefits being an important part here as well. And this is Utsira. It has a fascinating social ecological context that has been studied previously, and now we have a new European project where this is a specific case of how to make a digital twin to engage with the community. And this is a small island community of about 200 people. So this is in progress, and it's been a very, very fun way to engage. And right now, this is a bit of the irony, is that we are engaging with the municipality and with the developers. However, the parallel process of actually doing all the public consultation is ongoing. So we haven't been able to kind of cross the research into the actual process. And this is very interesting, I think, for Australia, because you guys are at a better place in a way to kind of learn from these, I would say it's called kind of institutional mismatching between research and governments. And we're dealing with it in a little bit bumpy way. It's just hard to coordinate all these things that have to be done. One of the things that came out of very new experience was the first time Norwegian state aid had to be reviewed under the European Free Trade Agreement Surveillance Authority. And this was a huge delay for Utsira North. However, they've figured it out. It's because the Norwegian government is going to give 3.5 billion euros in state subsidy to the developer that can bid the lowest energy price. And this is a kind of winner takes it all subsidy thing that is kind of specific to Norway, but also basically saying it is not profitable to build floating in Europe at the moment. And it's a successful project will be dependent on that state subsidy. But I also want to kind of point out that coexistence is many different things to different people, and that it shouldn't be kind of taken for granted that that coexistence is the same. And this is where the engagement comes in. Engagement through universal values is really important. It was mentioned by Larelle in a really great way about how credibility, legitimacy, saliency is really important. This is absolutely our learning in Norway. And in our engagement in other European projects, for example, the WindFloat Atlantic floating wind project off the coast of Portugal, and engaging citizens, municipality, different experts from the different industries along the value chain. This is iterative. It takes a lot of time, and it's important that it happens at the earliest stages of project design possible. And this is because process matters. This is what we know from post-normal science when we have uncertain conditions and high stakes and urgent decisions. The legitimacy of any outcome depends on the quality of the process. And this is a real important thing, I think, for Australia right now in Tasmania, that we get this process right and learning from this engagement. We have a model for inclusive offshore planning, and this was considered a real success among the fishers and other stakeholders, where when the Norwegian government did the planning of where offshore wind should be, it was a cross-sectoral inclusive of all the different data from aviation to fishers to you name it. So that was considered a real success. However, there's a big thing about expectations and compared to requirements. Requirements are the key. The government can have policies, and this is to Martin's part. The government can have, all the right policies, but what we see is when the Norwegian government didn't make sustainability monitoring or ecosystem monitoring part of the requirement, then industry didn't want to have it in. We clearly see a role how fishers could participate. However, what we are doing is challenging the status quo. And when we challenge the status quo of these inclusive processes, because we're making something new, it's not even status quo. This offshore wind is something totally new. We have to realize that a lot of different leadership training, a lot of different modes of practice are important to kind of break through that wall. And we really need to treat coexistence as ongoing trust building. It's not just a box to check. We're really talking about transformative change, societal transformation. And that means people doing things a little bit differently for really increased sustainability. Just to mention that in 2023, in the Nordic Marine Think Tank that I chair, we had a special issue and a special workshop talking about maritime space and user conflicts for offshore wind planning. And this is available as a ICES report. And I should also mention that we just got funded a new project where we're going to be working in a more transformative leadership way, how to lead with universal values, how to make these processes with the government and with the extended peer community really work. So that was short and sweet from Norway, and we look forward to answering any questions.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy, and for an early start to your day. Thank you to all the participants, including the up to 177 people engaged in the webinar so far. There's basically one question that I'll answer live, and there's a question for Dorothy that I'll come to that's in the chat room. A really good question: how are we working with governments towards developing offshore wind, especially in Victoria? The focus of this project originally was at the broader scale, and then clearly because of the orientation of us in Tasmania about a focus on the southeast, and it's clear now that the southeast, the Gippsland area, is going to be a priority as clearly the most developed wind zone. So we'll be the research that's been done, the reports will be done. The next stage follow-up projects will be engaging with state actors. Now, Dorothy, there's a question there for you about a floating wind. Would you like to address that? Can you see the question on the chat?
On the very, don't see it.
So Rod, can
you read it out?
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll read it out for you. Offshore floating wind, you said, is presently not financially viable without government subsidy.
Yeah.
Do you see this reliance on subsidy continuing, or at some point may it become financially viable without subsidy?
We definitely in Norway, there's basically subsidies are only there when it really has to be. We have no subsidies in our fishing fleet, for example. We haven't had that for like 20 or 30 years. So it is expected that it will be profitable, absolutely, in the long run, right? It may be, I don't know. I'm not going to give you a timeline, but it is expected that it will be profitable. Otherwise, the government wouldn't do something like that. Just like the government subsidy for carbon capture and storage, Northern Lights project, full scale in Norway. It's expected that CCS is profitable with different markets. So yeah, totally.
Thank you. I'll just catch up with any other open questions there. That's been done. Those questions have been answered there. So what I like to thank everybody for their engagement and attendance. This project was set up to be, in a sense, explore the development of this important contribution to our energy transition and transformation at a time where there was lots of uncertainty, and over time the uncertainties have changed, perhaps in scale and direction and scope, but they're still there. And so the next stage within the CRC, I'm hopeful that the offshore renewables program will continue to work on these activities and engage with a range of stakeholders and partners, and including our international collaborators in the CRC. And I thank the audience for engaging. I'd like to thank participants, my colleagues in the project, including Dorothy for early start. But also the last person I'd like to thank is Leslie Cowdery. Leslie's been the magician behind the scenes that's made all this work, and thank you, Leslie. Thank you, everybody. Have a great late afternoon, or in Dorothy's case, a great day. And remember that these webinar recording will be uploaded very soon onto the website at the CRC. So Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre, go onto their website. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you. Bye.